Behind the walls of a medieval castle, where knights honed their skills and lords decided destinies, there was a heart that beat at a completely different, feverish pace. It was the kitchen, a place where the magic of taste was created, and at the same time, real chaos reigned. We are used to thinking of castles as symbols of power and grandeur, but in reality, it was in this abode of fire and steam that the most invisible and everyday dangers lurked. Huge cauldrons, boiling fat, a strict hierarchy, and unsanitary conditions created a tense atmosphere where mistakes were costly. Watch the video to the end to find out why a single day's work in the kitchen could be more dangerous than a battlefield. It was a place where survival depended not only on skill, but also on luck. Building a kitchen in a medieval castle was a real architectural challenge. On the one hand, the kitchen was the most fire-prone place in the castle and had to be built from non-combustible materials. On the other hand, it had to be functional and able to feed hundreds of people. Therefore, kitchens were usually built of stone and located away from the main building so that in case of fire, the flames would not spread to the entire castle. The walls and ceilings were made very thick so that they could withstand high temperatures. The floor was made of stone so that fires could be lit on it. But even so, fires were very common. A single ember flying out of the hearth could turn the kitchen into an inferno in a matter of minutes. To avoid this, buckets of water and sand were always kept in the kitchen. The construction of a kitchen in a castle was always a compromise between safety and functionality. Although the walls and floor were made of stone, the roof and internal floors were often wooden. This was because wood was a cheaper and more accessible material, as well as being easier to work with. In addition, the walls had wooden beams that supported the ceiling and other structures. All of this created a fire hazard. Another problem was ventilation. Medieval kitchens did not have exhaust fans, and smoke escaped through an opening in the roof. This opening was a source of drafts that could fan the flames. In addition, smoke and soot accumulated on the walls and ceiling, making them more combustible. Over time, soot deposits could ignite from the intense heat. In medieval kitchens, fire was an uncontrollable force. The hearths were huge and constantly burning. The wood used for fuel was dry and burned very quickly. Sparks and embers flying out of the hearth could set fire to anything nearby. To control the fire in some way, cooks used special tongs and shovels. But this did not always help. One wrong move and a person could get burned. There was always a lot of firewood in the kitchen. It was stored next to the hearths so that it was always close at hand. This was very convenient, but also very dangerous. Dry firewood could catch fire from a single spark, and then it would be impossible to stop the fire. In addition to firewood, there was a lot of grease and oil in the kitchen. They were used for frying and cooking. Grease could catch fire from a single spark and cause a fire. Why do you think, despite all these precautions, kitchens still burned with enviable regularity? Share your opinion in the comments. Of course, the main factor that led to fires was human error. Cooks and their assistants worked in a hurry and did not have time to watch the fire. They could forget to turn off the fire, leave something on the stove, or drop something flammable. In addition, there were many people in the kitchen, and any one of them could have caused a fire. One wrong move, and a person could drop something into the fire or set their clothes on fire. Thus, the medieval kitchen was the most fire-prone place in the castle. Despite all the precautions, fires were very common, and they were caused not only by architectural flaws, but also by human error. In the Middle Ages, there were no refrigerators, and food was stored in open spaces, which led to unsanitary conditions. Meat, fish, and other foods could be left on tables for several days, creating ideal conditions for bacteria to multiply. Flies and other insects were constant guests in the kitchen. They landed on food, spread germs, and left their traces. This was very dangerous, as it could lead to food poisoning and disease. Medieval kitchens did not have refrigerators, and food was stored in open spaces, which led to unsanitary conditions. Meat, fish, and other foods could sit on tables for several days, creating ideal conditions for bacteria to multiply. Flies and other insects were constant guests, spreading germs and leaving traces. This was very dangerous and could lead to food poisoning and disease. To combat unsanitary conditions, cats and dogs were kept in the kitchen to catch mice and rats. But they too were carriers of disease and dirt. Drinking water sources were often located near sewage disposal sites. Well water could be contaminated with bacteria that caused dysentery, typhoid fever, and cholera. Rivers and lakes from which water was taken for cooking were places for washing, waste disposal, and even watering animals. Water filtration and purification were not practiced, so waterborne diseases were commonplace. Garbage piles accumulated in the streets and backyards, attracting rats and mice. These rodents were not only carriers of disease, but also pests that destroyed food supplies. Medieval houses had no running water or sewage systems. Waste was dumped directly onto the street from windows or into special drainage ditches. Regular hand and body washing was not widespread, and dirty clothes and poor personal hygiene contributed to the spread of lice, fleas, and other parasites. All this created ideal conditions for epidemics that wiped out entire families. In addition, grease and dirt often accumulated in kitchens. Dishes were rarely washed, and tables and floors were damp and dirty. This created an ideal environment for mold and fungi to grow, which spoiled food and caused disease. During crop failures and famines, people ate whatever they could find, including spoiled meat, rotten vegetables, and moldy bread. This led to mass food poisoning. In the kitchens of the poor, where it was impossible to carefully select food, the situation was even worse. They ate food contaminated with bacteria and parasites, which led to chronic diseases. Even rich people were not immune to food poisoning. To hide the unpleasant taste of rotten food, cooks seasoned it heavily with spices. However, this did not kill the bacteria. For example, at that time, there was no understanding that spoiled meat could cause serious illness. Constant epidemics caused by unsanitary conditions led to huge human losses. Entire villages died out from disease, and cities became centers of infection. This had a devastating effect on the economy and social structure of society. As a result of epidemics, the number of workers decreased, trade links were disrupted, and society was plunged into chaos. Epidemics also had psychological consequences. People lived in constant fear and anxiety. The plague and other terrible diseases were considered divine punishment, and doctors were powerless in the face of unknown threats. Today, when we look at medieval towns and castles, we imagine a romantic picture of knights fighting for honor and beautiful ladies waiting for their return. However, the reality was much darker and more dangerous, and it affected everyone, from peasants to kings. Have you ever wondered what price people paid for their status? What is it like to be at the top of the food chain when every day is a struggle for survival and mistakes can cost not only your career, but your life? Watch the video to the end to find out the answer to this question. The kitchen in the castle was not just a place for cooking, but a veritable empire with a strict hierarchy. At the top was the head chef, who was responsible for everything that happened in the kitchen. He was a true master of his craft, and the taste and quality of the food depended on him. Below him were cooks who specialized in different dishes. Some prepared meat, some fish, and some baked goods. Each had their own area of responsibility and their own assistants. At the bottom of the hierarchy were the errand boys, or kitchen rats. They did the dirtiest and hardest work, carrying water, chopping wood, cleaning vegetables, and washing dishes. Their life was very hard, and they often worked 12-14 hours a day without days off. The work in the kitchen was so hard that many couldn't take it and left. Those who stayed often suffered from injuries and illnesses. The life of a chef was difficult but prestigious. His word was law, and his authority was unquestioned. Not only did the mood of the owners depend on the chef, but also their health. He had to be not just a cook, but also an organizer, manager, and even a psychologist. He was responsible for the quality of the food, its storage, and the entire team. If a dish turned out badly, he took all the blame. If the dinner was excellent, he alone received the praise. He was required not only to be skilled, but also to have an impeccable reputation, because the slightest suspicion of incompetence or dishonesty could cost him his job. Under the guidance of the head chef, there were sous chefs, or senior chefs, who were his right-hand men. They were responsible for specific areas of work, such as the meat department, sauce preparation, or baking. Sous chefs were experienced and knowledgeable professionals, and their work was highly valued. They were responsible for training junior chefs and kitchen assistants. Sous chefs had to be able to work quickly and efficiently to keep up with the pace set by the head chef. Their role was critical, as the overall quality of the dishes depended on their coordinated work. The next level was occupied by ordinary chefs. Each of them had their own specialization. They were responsible for preparing certain dishes under the supervision of the sous chefs. For example, there was a chef who was only responsible for roasts, or a chef who only prepared soups. They had to be masters of their craft and know all the subtleties of preparing their dishes. These chefs often came from simple families where they were taught the basics of culinary art. To get a job at the castle, they had to prove their skill and ability. At the lowest level of the hierarchy were the errand boys, or kitchen rats. They were the youngest and most inexperienced members of the team, and their work was the hardest and dirtiest. They carried firewood, lit the stoves, cleaned vegetables, washed dishes, and carried out all the orders of their superiors. Their working hours were unlimited and could reach 14 hours a day. For their work, they received only food and shelter, but this was the only way to get ahead and have a chance to become a chef. They slept on the floor in the kitchen or in a storeroom, and their lives were full of deprivation and hard labor. Despite the harsh working conditions, many of these boys dreamed of becoming chefs one day. They learned by watching their elders, and if they were lucky, they were entrusted with more difficult tasks. If a boy showed himself in a good light, he was given the opportunity to climb the hierarchical ladder. But this was rare and most never succeeded. The strict hierarchy in the kitchen was necessary to maintain order and discipline. When you had to cook for dozens or even hundreds of people, everyone had to know their place and their responsibilities. Without a clear division of roles and responsibilities, the whole operation would have descended into chaos. Thanks to this system, the kitchen could run like clockwork, providing the hosts and guests with delicious and varied food. However, for those at the bottom, it was a world of hard work and unfulfilled dreams. Fire was the heart of the medieval kitchen, but also its most dangerous element. Open hearths built directly on the floor or in massive stone ovens posed a constant threat. Smoke escaping through a hole in the roof often filled the room, causing coughing and tears. But that was the least of the evils. The unpredictability of the flames, which could get out of control at any moment, was far more frightening. Sparks flew in all directions, threatening to ignite flammable kitchen utensils, firewood, straw for bedding, and, of course, animal fat, which was used for cooking and lighting. All this turned the kitchen into a powder keg. To protect themselves as best they could, cooks wore thick, not always clean clothes and tried to keep a safe distance from the fire. But in the cramped space of the kitchen, where several people worked at the same time, this was almost impossible. Any careless movement could lead to disaster. Burns were commonplace. Often they were so severe that they left lifelong scars. But the main danger was not so much the flames themselves as their ability to spread at incredible speed. If a fire started, it was almost impossible to stop, and it could quickly spread to the entire house, threatening not only the kitchen but also the lives of everyone inside. But fire was not the only source of danger. The equipment used to prepare food posed an equal risk. First and foremost were knives. Medieval knives were much heavier than modern ones and often had awkward wooden handles that slipped in the hand. They were used not only for cutting meat and vegetables, but also for rough work such as splitting bones. They were rarely sharpened and not very well, so they were more often blunt than sharp, which increased the likelihood of slipping and injuring the hand. Another indispensable but dangerous tool was the axe. In medieval kitchens, it was used for cutting up carcasses, splitting wood, and even chopping some vegetables. The axe was heavy, clumsy, and required considerable strength and skill. One wrong swing could result in serious injury, and in the absence of proper medical care, even a small wound could be fatal due to infection. Of course, in addition to knives and axes, there were other sharp objects in the kitchen. Meat hooks, spits for roasting, metal grates. All of these had sharp edges and corners that could easily cause injury in the rush and confusion. Often these items were poorly secured or simply lying on the floor, creating yet another hazard. However, despite all the dangers, the cooks continued to work. Their work was hard but necessary. They were masters of their craft, capable of turning simple ingredients into veritable feasts. They knew how to control fire, how to handle sharp tools, and how to deal with the dangers that lurked at every turn. Their resilience and skill were key to the survival and prosperity of medieval society. But was fire more dangerous, or were the tools? What was more dangerous for a cook? The unpredictable flames or their own equipment? Stay with us to find out the answer to this question. Medieval kitchens, in addition to the danger of fire, harbored another, no less serious threat: sharp and heavy tools that were necessary for cooking. These items were, in essence, weapons in the hands of cooks. Knives, cleavers, axes, and awls were used to cut meat, fish, and vegetables. They were rough, heavy, and not always well sharpened, which made them even more unpredictable to work with. The lack of modern technology and safety standards meant that any careless movement could result in a serious injury. Knives were particularly dangerous. Medieval knives were a far cry from their modern counterparts. Their blades were often massive and clumsy, and the wooden handles could slip in the hands, especially when they were greasy or wet. Cooks worked in a constant rush, trying to serve their masters, and this increased the risk of accidents. They could cut their hands, fingers, or even lose them. A dull blade required more effort, and the knife could slip, causing a deep wound. Another indispensable but equally dangerous tool was the axe. In medieval kitchens, it was used to chop up carcasses, split firewood for the hearth, and even grind some particularly hard foods. The axe was heavy and unwieldy, requiring considerable strength and skill from the cook. One wrong blow could result in serious injury, and in the absence of proper medical care, even a small wound could turn into a fatal infection. Kitchens often had special cleavers, massive knives with wide blades designed for cutting meat and bones, which also posed a serious threat. However, the danger did not come only from sharp objects. There were many heavy objects in the kitchen that could cause harm. Cast iron pots and pans, which were heated over an open fire, were incredibly heavy. Cooks had to carry them, and one wrong move could cause the hot utensils to fall to the floor, scalding someone with boiling water or hot fat, or falling on their foot. Stone mortars and pestles for grinding spices and herbs were also heavy. They could fall out of your hands or tip over, causing injury. Along with knives and axes, other tools were also used in medieval kitchens that were equally dangerous. Hooks for hanging meat, spits for roasting, and metal grates had sharp edges and corners that could easily cause injury in the hustle and bustle. These items were often poorly secured or simply left lying on the floor, creating yet another hazard. Cooks frequently tripped over them, sustaining bruises and cuts. All this, combined with open flames and heavy utensils, made working in the kitchen incredibly dangerous. In addition, the working conditions themselves were extremely unfavorable. The kitchen was cramped, stuffy, and poorly lit. Greasy fumes, smoke, and heat from the stoves created an unbearable atmosphere in which it was difficult to concentrate. Fatigue and stuffiness reduced attention, which increased the risk of accidents. Cooks and their assistants working long hours were exhausted, which also contributed to mistakes. All these dangers, sharp objects, heavy utensils, open fire, made the work of a cook one of the most dangerous in the Middle Ages. Accidents were very common. Cooks and their assistants constantly suffered cuts, bruises, burns, and fractures. Many of them bore scars and other marks on their bodies that were evidence of their hard and dangerous work. These scars were not only physical marks, but also a kind of professional badge that told the story of what they had been through. Despite all the risks, the cooks continued their work. They were masters of their craft, capable of creating culinary masterpieces in conditions of constant danger. Their fortitude, endurance, and skill were key to the survival and prosperity of medieval society. However, each of them knew that in the kitchen, they were not only creators, but also warriors who faced potentially deadly dangers at every turn. Spices in the Middle Ages were a real luxury, available only to the elite. Their delivery from distant Eastern countries cost a fortune, making them a symbol of wealth and status. Cooks working for wealthy lords had the opportunity to use these precious ingredients. Spices such as pepper, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg did not just add a refined taste to dishes, they also played a practical role in cooking, helping to mask the taste and smell of stale meat. In those days, when refrigerators did not exist and food storage was a real problem, spices were a lifesaver, making food more palatable. However, their use required not only skill, but also great care. Spices were very concentrated, and their dosage was critical. A mistake by the cook could ruin the entire dish, turning it from an exquisite delicacy into something inedible. But there was a much more serious danger. Some spices, in large doses, were poisonous. For example, nutmeg, when consumed in excess, could cause hallucinations, nausea, and even death. Cooks who worked with spices had to be true alchemists, measuring each gram precisely to avoid disaster. Given the value of spices, their storage was strictly regulated. They were usually kept in special chests or boxes, often locked, and only the head chef had access to them. This system prevented theft, but did not always prevent misuse. Calculation errors or simple carelessness could lead to disastrous consequences. Poisoning caused by the incorrect use of spices was not uncommon, although people tried not to talk about it. Another danger was counterfeiting. Since spices were very expensive, they were often diluted with other, cheaper, and sometimes harmful substances. For example, black pepper could be mixed with juniper berries or even ash. By buying spices from unscrupulous traders, cooks put their masters at risk, as even a small amount of adulteration could be harmful to health. It was almost impossible to detect counterfeits, and cooks often acted at their own risk. Thus, working with spices was a delicate art bordering on science and requiring deep knowledge and experience. Chefs who knew how to use these precious ingredients correctly were highly valued, but any of them could make a fatal mistake. They were on the front line, battling the danger of poisoning every day to create culinary masterpieces for their masters. However, it wasn't just expensive spices that posed a threat. What if the main danger wasn't in a box of expensive spices, but in the simplest of jugs? Keep watching the video to find out what we're talking about. In the Middle Ages, water was the cornerstone of any kitchen. It was used for cooking, washing food and dishes, and cleaning. But unlike modern conveniences, obtaining clean water was a real problem and a great danger. Medieval cities did not have centralized water supply systems, so people relied on natural sources, wells, rivers, and streams. Unfortunately, these sources were often located near burial sites, landfills, and sewers, which made the water dirty and dangerous. Wells, which were supposed to be a symbol of clean water, often became sources of infection. They were contaminated by sewage seeping from cesspools and drainage ditches. Rivers and streams flowing through cities turned into open sewers, where human waste, slaughterhouse waste, and other sewage were dumped. This polluted water was the main source of many terrible diseases, such as cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever, which could spread quickly and lead to mass epidemics. Cooks, unaware of microbes and bacteria, unwittingly became carriers of these diseases. They used dirty water to prepare soups, stew meat, and even wash vegetables, which led to food contamination. Food poisoning and intestinal infections were commonplace, and many people suffered from them every day. In the absence of antibiotics in modern medicine, even a minor illness could be fatal. To protect themselves in some way, people invented primitive methods of purification. One of the most common was boiling. It was believed that fire purified water, and cooks often boiled it before use. This method did help to destroy some harmful microorganisms, but it was not a panacea. Water could become contaminated after boiling due to dirty dishes. Or worse, boiling was not always sufficient to kill all pathogens. In some cases, when there was too much water and not enough firewood, cooks would use it without boiling, putting everyone at risk. Another method was to add vinegar or wine to the water. The acid in these liquids also helped kill some of the bacteria. However, this method was expensive, so it was rarely used and mainly for preparing drinks for wealthy lords. For ordinary people, water remained the main threat to their health. Thus, water in the medieval kitchen was a source of life and at the same time, a source of deadly danger. It was necessary for survival, but it carried a hidden threat that people of that time had no idea about. This invisible danger was far more insidious than fire and sharp knives, as it could not be seen, felt, or avoided. It was a silent threat that could strike anyone who dared to drink a simple glass of water. Over time, understanding of the importance of clean water grew. During the Renaissance, with the development of science and medicine, people began to realize the connection between hygiene and disease. This led to a gradual improvement in sanitary conditions, albeit very slow. The construction of aqueducts and fountains in some cities was a step forward, providing access to cleaner water, but these benefits were not available to everyone. The majority of the population continued to use the same dirty sources as their ancestors. The situation began to change dramatically only in the 19th century, with the onset of the Industrial Revolution and the growth of cities. Rapid population growth exacerbated the sanitary crisis, leading to horrific epidemics. It was at this time that there was an urgent need for radical solutions. The emergence of the first water supply and sewage systems was a real revolution, although for a long time they were the privilege of the rich. Public health began to develop, and scientists began to actively investigate the causes of the spread of disease, gradually coming to an understanding of microbes. These discoveries were a real breakthrough. When it was proven that microorganisms in water were the cause of cholera and typhoid fever, the widespread construction of sewage treatment plants began. Water filtration and disinfection became mandatory procedures. This forever changed everyday life and cooking. For the first time in history, chefs could be sure that the water they used was safe. Today, tap water, which undergoes numerous stages of purification, is considered the safest and most accessible in most developed countries, allowing us to forget about the dangers that once lurked in our ancestors' kitchens. Medieval kitchens, constantly shrouded in smoke from open fires and permeated with the smells of cooking, were places where dirt and grease accumulated at an incredible rate. Soot settled on the walls, ceiling, and floor, mixing with grease splatters, food scraps, and other debris. This sticky, dark mixture created the perfect environment for bacteria, insects, and rodents to thrive, turning the kitchen into a hotbed of unsanitary conditions. The lack of modern cleaning products and understanding of hygiene made this problem virtually unsolvable. Cleaning in a medieval kitchen was hard, thankless, and most importantly, rare work. It was mainly done by boys on errands or the lowest-ranking cook's assistants. These young people, with neither the proper tools nor knowledge of proper cleaning, struggled with dirt using primitive means. Their arsenal consisted only of buckets of water and stiff brushes, which did not always cope with stubborn stains. Dirty water smeared grease across the floor, and soot simply moved from place to place without disappearing completely. As a result, after such cleaning, the kitchen looked a little cleaner, but remained a breeding ground for germs. The problem was not only the lack of proper tools and technology, but also the design of the kitchen itself. The floors, often made of compacted earth or rough stone, had many cracks and uneven surfaces where dirt accumulated. Open hearths produced huge amounts of soot, which settled on all surfaces. The lack of ventilation, except for a smoke vent in the roof, prevented air from circulating, so the kitchen was constantly filled with the smell of smoke and old grease. All this created a vicious circle. Dirt was everywhere, but it was almost impossible to clean it effectively. The boys who were assigned to cleaning had neither the motivation nor the time to do the job properly. Their work was poorly paid, and they were often subjected to humiliation and beatings. They had to constantly carry heavy buckets of water, scrub dirty floors and walls, all in conditions of constant heat and stuffiness. It is not surprising that many of them could not cope with their duties, and the kitchen remained dirty. Despite all efforts, cleaning was only a temporary solution. Soon, a new layer of soot, grease, and dirt accumulated in the kitchen, and the cycle began again. This endless and pointless cycle ultimately affected the quality and safety of the food. Dirty dishes, tables, and floors were sources of contamination, and even if the cook used clean water and fresh ingredients, they could be spoiled due to unsanitary conditions. Moreover, constant unsanitary conditions led to frequent cases of food poisoning, which were common at the time and could have fatal consequences. Cooks unaware of the existence of microbes could not understand the true cause of these problems. Ultimately, cleaning in a medieval kitchen was not so much a battle against dirt as it was against the era itself. It was a struggle against a lack of knowledge, technology, and hygiene, which chefs and their assistants, unfortunately, lost every day. Cookware in a medieval kitchen was nothing like the lightweight and durable modern equivalents. It was heavy, bulky, and most importantly, dangerous. Cast iron cauldrons, clay pots, and wooden bowls formed the basis of kitchen utensils. Each of these items had its own drawbacks and posed unique risks to cooks. Working with such cookware required not only strength but also incredible caution. Cast iron pots were indispensable for cooking soups, stews, and other dishes that were cooked over an open fire. They were incredibly heavy, especially when filled with water or food. Lifting such a pot full of boiling water and moving it from the hearth was akin to a feat of strength. Cooks who worked with these pots often suffered burns, bruises, and even broken bones if the heavy cookware fell. Their rough, uncomfortable handles did not provide a secure grip, and one wrong move could lead to disaster. Clay pots, although lighter than cast iron, posed their own dangers. They were extremely fragile and could break from any impact or fall. If a pot broke, its sharp shards could cause serious cuts. Moreover, when heated over a fire, clay pots could crack, especially if they contained water. This not only led to the loss of food, but also to dangerous burns from spilled boiling water. Considering that cooks worked in a hurry and in a rush, the risk of breaking a pot was very high. Wooden bowls and spoons seemed safer, but they were not harmless either. Wood has a tendency to absorb grease and moisture, creating ideal conditions for bacteria to multiply. Over time, cracks and crevices formed on the surface of wooden utensils, where food residue accumulated and was almost impossible to clean out. This led to the spread of disease and food poisoning. In addition, old and worn wooden bowls could split, leaving sharp splinters in the food that could injure people. Every piece of tableware used by cooks was a potential hazard. One wrong move, 1 second of inattention, and you could be seriously injured. Cooks working under constant stress and physical strain were forced to constantly balance between efficiency and safety. They had to be extremely careful not to drop a heavy pot, break a fragile pot, or cut themselves on a sharp edge. Working with such utensils was not only dangerous, but also physically exhausting. Constantly lifting and carrying heavy objects led to injuries to the back, joints, and muscles. Over time, this took its toll on the cook's health, making their work even more difficult and dangerous. Ultimately, the cookware in a medieval kitchen was yet another reminder of the harsh conditions in which cooks had to work, and that even the simplest objects could pose a hidden danger. In a medieval castle, the kitchen was rarely located near the storerooms where provisions were kept. This architectural feature created serious logistical problems, turning the delivery of food into hard and exhausting work. Cooks and their assistants had to carry huge amounts of supplies by hand. These included sacks of grain, baskets of vegetables, barrels of oil and wine, and animal carcasses. All of this had to be transported from the storerooms across the entire castle, often through narrow, dark corridors and steep spiral staircases. Transporting food was physically demanding work. Auxiliary workers, often boys or low-ranking servants, constantly carried heavy loads, which led to back and joint injuries. In the constant rush to prepare feasts for the lords, they could trip, fall, and not only injure themselves but also spoil precious provisions. For example, if a person fell, they could break a barrel of wine or drop an animal carcass, which was a great loss for the kitchen and was punishable by punishment. An even bigger problem was food storage. In those days, there were no refrigerators. Warehouses were simple, often open rooms that were poorly ventilated and unprotected from pests. Meat and fish were stored in special cellars or smokehouses, but even there they quickly spoiled, especially in warm weather. Vegetables and fruits were kept in baskets, where they rotted or dried out, and grain and flour became easy prey for mice and rats. This led to huge food losses. In such conditions, cooks had to possess not only culinary skills, but also be excellent quality controllers. They constantly inspected food to detect signs of spoilage in time. Any mistake in this matter could have serious consequences. The use of stale meat or spoiled vegetables could cause mass food poisoning among the nobility, which in turn could lead to dismissal, loss of reputation, and even imprisonment for the cook. Thus, chefs were forced to constantly struggle with the problem of food spoilage. They had to have in-depth knowledge of how to properly store and use supplies to minimize losses. This required not only physical endurance, but also a high level of responsibility and attention to detail. In the end, their work was not only about cooking, but also about a constant battle with logistical difficulties and the threat of food spoilage. So, we have completed our dangerous culinary journey through the Middle Ages. We saw how risky the work of cooks was, who had to deal with fire, sharp tools, heavy utensils, and even invisible bacteria. Their work was a real feat, and we hope we were able to convey the spirit of that time to you. What topic would you like to see in the next episodes? Perhaps you are interested in learning about medieval knight tournaments, the life of ordinary peasants, or how impregnable castles were built. Write your ideas in the comments, and, of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the new videos we make for you.